And now the breaking news over in Australia. Paul Keating, as the Prime Minister from back in the 1990s, is returning to try and take on the right down under.
I'm Ken Brackman, and this just in. Former Prime Minister Paul Keating has announced he is returning to Parliament in Australia.
You would not actually believe this. That's the Aussie equivalent of if Bill Clinton came back to run for president. Oh, wait.
In 2013, Kevin Rudd lost the federal election to Tony Abbott's Liberal Party, and though they didn't know it, the Labor Party was preparing themselves for a decade in opposition. But what if they had an ace of spades up their sleeves ready to play? What if the last decade looked entirely different? What if Paul Keating came back to Parliament? So for the purposes of this thought exercise, we're going to pick up the story in September of 2013. Now, Rudd had led the Labor Party to the polls, but after Abbott's resounding victory, it was clear that his time as leader was done and that he'd resigned from both leadership and Parliament. Because of this would trigger a by-election for his seat of Griffith in early 2014. As 2013 came to an end, it was looking like one of the senior leaders in Queensland Labor, Terry Butler, would be the chosen candidate. But in October, the legendary Keating appeared on the 7:30 report with Lee Sales, where Sales asked him if he had ruled out a return to politics. Keating replied that for nearly 2 decades he'd been at peace with the idea of retirement, but now, to quote him with that clown Abbott in, he just couldn't stand to be there. As the weeks followed, speculation about Keating going for Griffith began to grow. Andrew Bolt slammed Labor for parachuting a candidate into Queensland, Bob Hawke said a Prime Minister should know when to bow out, and John Howard even said that Keating should have put his hand up before the election for a safe Sydney seat, like Peter Garrett's Kingford Smith seat that was up for grabs. When the press went to new opposition leader Bill Shorten, he dodged the issue, saying that it was a matter for the Queensland branch to determine. Abbott had run a staunchly conservative campaign, and Kevin Rudd had only marginally held Griffith as Prime Minister. With Terry Butler coming from Labor left, the Queensland branch made the remarkable decision to choose Paul Keating to be the Labor candidate for Griffith. This would end up being the most televised by-election in history. Worst of all, Keating got in a spat with the Greens, blaming them for imploding Gillard's government, while the Greens called him a corporatist sellout. Incredibly, the Greens preferenced the Liberals over Labor, and Keating took them to town, calling them delusional for thinking Abbott deserved their preferences. In February of 2014, the polls came in. The Libs won a majority with 44% of the vote compared to Labor's 38%. With the Greens preferencing the Libs, Anthony Green declared a Liberal victory in Griffith. But he was wrong. As the count came in on Sunday, it was clear that Greens voters found Abbott unfathomable, and they defied the party to preference Keating, giving Labor an extra 10%. Keating was back in Parliament. As Keating sat down with the ABC in South Brisbane, they asked him if he'd challenge for leadership of the party. Keating was clear though. The Labor Party had recently changed their rules so that leadership spills could only happen after elections. Shorten would be the leader of Labor until the next election. The next day, the press asked Shorten if Keating would form part of his shadow ministry, to which Shorten said, "While I respect Keating's expertise, and while he is a legend of the party, I will not, I repeat, will not be removing anyone from their ministry positions." Though Parliament was Keating's old stomping ground, as a backbencher, he wouldn't be given the floor to attack Abbott. That would have to come through the press. And amongst all of Abbott's gaffes, where Keating would hit him hardest was on relations with Indonesia. You see, back in the 90s, Keating had worked really hard to create an alliance with President Suharto, but by 2014, reports had emerged that ASIO had been spying on the Indonesian president, including attempted phone tapping. Though this happened under the Rudd government, Abbott refused to apologise for it, and Indonesia withdrew their ambassador. Although Keating was furious at this, Shorten refused to criticise Abbott, and once again a gulf within the Labor Party started to emerge. Later in 2014, reports began to surface that Julie Bishop talked Tony Abbott out of sending soldiers to Ukraine after Russia shot down MH17. Keating was scathing in the press, calling him an absolute nutter who's purely reactive with no vision. Reporters pressed him on whether the issue was with the party or with the person, and Keating minced no words.
"The problem is absolutely with Abbott. Though I have my disagreements with people like Bishop and Turnbull, they are far more qualified for the title of leader."
This would make global news.
Well, the former Prime Minister of Australia, Paul Keating, called right-wing leader Tony Abbott, quote, "an absolute nutter." This is coming from the so-called tolerant left.
As Abbott slid badly in the polls, he came out on the attack and said,
Now, it is true that my popularity is worse than any recent Prime Minister. Well, not worse than any recent Prime Minister. You can thank Mr. Keating for sparing me that title.
And Abbott was adamant that he would take the Libs to the polls in 2016. The party didn't agree. And though Abbott fended off a challenge in early 2015, Turnbull came to exact revenge and dethroned him as Prime Minister. When Keating was asked of his thoughts, he said,
Well, at least with the poor man's Howard gone, we can have an election of actual substance.
Now, I won't labour the 2016 election because that would have played out all the same, with Turnbull scraping through with the slimmest of majorities. Where the story gets really interesting is what happens in Labour afterwards. According to Labour's bylaws that were amended after the Rudd-Gillard debacle, only after an election could a challenger challenge for leadership of the party. Shorten announced his intention to seek renomination as party leader, but there were 3 other candidates who put their hand up. Anthony Albanese, who had put his hand up in 2013, Chris Bowen, who had been the interim leader before, and of course Paul Keating, who had no intention of remaining on the sidelines. After a few days, it became clear that there were only 2 real contenders, Shorten and Keating. Albanese pledged his support for Shorten, while Bowen pledged his support for Keating. Bowen used to be close mates with Shorten, but during Shorten's first term as opposition leader, the two had fallen out. And it was here that Bowen proved pivotal. He gathered support for all those MPs disgruntled by Gillard's 2010 coup, and Bowen painted Shorten as a party traitor for backing Gillard, and that Keating was the only one from Labour's right capable of punching through Turnbull's tagline of jobs and growth. While Albanese tried to remind the caucus that he too had supported Rudd, it was to little avail. Keating was back, and it was time to destroy Turnbull the same way he destroyed successive Liberal leaders in the early 90s. Despite being distraught at the result, given he'd nearly won government on his first go, and was still considered a rising star within the party, Shorten proved himself to be a team player and accepted a position in Keating's shadow cabinet. Let me know in the comments below, would you have voted for Keating or Shorten in this leadership ballot? Very surprisingly though, Keating didn't go on the attack straight away, in fact praising Turnbull for his deal with the French to replace the outgoing Collins-class submarines with the attack-class submarines. The press also hounded Keating for having earlier praised Turnbull in his criticism of Abbott, but at the end of 2016, the beast was let out of the cage. After Turnbull finally passed the Australian Building and Construction Commission, basically an organisation to heavily regulate the power of construction unions, Keating went to town.
The Prime Minister talks about jobs and growth, Mr. Speaker. What about the hundreds of thousands of construction workers that now can't put a bloody union sticker on their helmet? If he really cared about growth, why on earth would he join that bastardly TPP that attempts to contain the second biggest economy in the world and our largest, I repeat, largest trading partner? He says that China got us out of the GFC, which is a crock of BS in itself.
Can the member for Griffith please withdraw that comment?
Mr. Speaker, he says China got us out of the GFC and now he wants to join a trade network without them. Honestly, what would this guy die in a ditch for? His mates on the BLW Rich 200 list?
Turnbull got up to try and return the serve.
He was such a sycophant, a social climbing sycophant, if ever there was one. There has never been a more sycophantic leader of the Labor Party than this one, and he comes here and poses as a tribune of the people.
Turnbull continued, piling on Keating for keeping his Potts Point house while trying to pose as a representative of the people. Keating would continue to savage Malcolm Turnbull until Dutton led an insurrection against him in the party room over setting emissions targets with the National Energy Guarantee. When Turnbull dropped those emissions targets, Keating put the boot in.
I rest my case. He was supposed to be the Liberal who cared about climate change. What would this guy go to the trenches for?
The whole debacle saw Turnbull rolled, with Scott Morrison defeating Dutton for leadership of the party. Keating broke convention and declined to give Turnbull a civil farewell speech, instead saying,
"You are the last hope for the Tories and you rolled over like a cocker spaniel. Watch your beloved party get dragged further to the right."
This drew much criticism from the press for showing a lack of class. The Labour caucus urged him to be more disciplined with that sort of stuff, but Keating's message to them was clear. You've won one majority government since I was gone. Trust the process. There was pushback on this from members like Albanese, and Shorten even canvassed the idea of getting rid of negative gearing to make housing more affordable. Keating retorted,
"You're right, Bill. I had your opinion when I had it out with Bob in the 80s. The reality is that the housing market is a pure Ponzi scheme that can't be touched if you want any chance of winning in May.
Keating's campaign was ruthless, yet brilliantly framed. He said that he came out of retirement because he was watching the government squander Australia's economic future by doling out to their mates in fossil fuels. The potential in battery technology, renewable energy, and electric vehicles was so great that Keating even called Australia as having the potential to be the Saudi Arabia of the 21st century. On a personal level, Keating piled on ScoMo for his marketing background, and in a Channel 9 debate, he directly asked him to list one way in which he had served the nation before entering politics. But it didn't just stop there. He said ScoMo was held ransom by the cowboys in green who encouraged floodplain harvesting, destroying the Murray-Darling downstream, and leading to millions of dead cod polluting the river. In an unconventional move, he declined interviews with Channel 9 and instead appeared on air with rising YouTube commentator Friendly Geordies. His campaign slogan was "Unleash our economic power," and when asked about the student protesters protesting against a lack of action on climate change, Keating said,
Well, I admire their passion, I question their wisdom. This won't do anything. Politics isn't about patting yourself on the back. In fact, most change can come from your pocketbook, and climate change is a really great economic opportunity for Australia.
As much as Keating wanted to, he stayed clear of franking credits and negative gearing so that Morrison had no ammo on new taxes. And in May of 2019, Australia went to the polls with betting odds at pretty much even. The Liberals started strong with surprisingly good results in Queensland, but as the night went on, the marginal seats like Reid, Robertson and Chisholm increasingly went the way of Labor. After Swan in Western Australia went the way of Labor, Morrison had to make the phone call he was dreading, and he phoned Keating to concede. As Keating entered the Labor building, a roaring crowd welcomed him to the mic, where he said,
"I know Howard calls himself Lazarus, but my goodness, we've just taken that title from him."
Remarkably, Keating very frankly said that he won't remain for generations and that this government was all about steering the ship back in the right direction. Now, Keating's first few months back in office would prove to be fairly uneventful. In November, he'd visit Bangkok to participate in a Quad meeting where he was cooperative yet muted in his enthusiasm. Behind closed doors, he urged President Trump to end the trade war with China and told him to consider Kevin Rudd's proposals for the Phase 1 agreement. Trump took great personal offense at this, and this would prove to be the beginning of a strained relationship. But Keating would have to rush back from Bangkok as the fires that were starting to ravage northern New South Wales were spreading further south. As Keating arrived back home in November, Greater Sydney was declared to be in catastrophic danger. Back in March, at the request of Shorten, Keating had promised that the government would spend $80 million on a bushfire fighting fleet that included retrofitted Black Hawk helicopters. The first batch of these were ready to go and immediately targeted central New South Wales and the Blue Mountains. As all of this was happening, the opposition leader was notably absent and had gone to Hawaii. When reports emerged about this, Morrison announced that he'd informed Paul Keating of his holiday, but Keating avidly denied this. With Morrison slammed by the press and being unable to produce the evidence of his claims, rumours of a leadership spill began to circle. Keating had started strong by preparing for the fire season, but had a chink in his armour with the strained relationship with Donald Trump. If the new Liberal leader could get him on national security, it could have a path forward to win in 2022. The spill motion just got over the line and both Josh Frydenberg and Peter Dutton contested the leadership. With national security appearing to be the best messaging to hit, and with Frydenberg in a marginal seat, Dutton won the ballot and became the new opposition leader. Though the fires were devastating and even spread to the New South Wales south coast by early 2020, Keating's leadership certainly wasn't in question. While Scott Morrison had left on a holiday, Keating had been prepared for this and had at least some water bombers ready to go. While Dutton was getting cold reactions as he shook hands, Keating was literally crying with the people of the Shoalhaven. As the fires started to subside by the end of January, Keating had no room to breathe as someone in Victoria tested positive to this new coronavirus. Though Keating had stockpiled masks, testing kits and created isolation rules from December 2019, he was hesitant about closing off borders to China, given that China had just signed the Phase 1 trade deal with America and the two were once again on reasonable terms. Keating initially placed a travel ban on those coming from Wuhan, but when a positive case arrived from Guangzhou, he made the tough decision to temporarily ban all travel from China except for Australian citizens. The media pounced on this, calling him racist, and Keating went off at them, saying for years they've criticised him for being too friendly to China. Now all of a sudden he has racial hatred for them? As Keating was frank that Australia may enter a lockdown, Dutton was scathing, calling it a crime against freedom and a crime against the economy. But it got worse for Keating. By February, the virus was no longer specific to China, but was now really prominent in Spain and Italy. There had been no further cases in Australia, but to prevent it from coming down would mean banning global visitors. Keating put out an urgent recall for all Australians to return immediately. But as this was happening, there was another positive case in Australia, this time from Europe. Keating's worst fears were realised and he knew what this would mean. Keating called a snap lockdown and this was met with extreme outrage as other countries were not yet in lockdown. However, as COVID ravaged America and Britain in March, this decision was particularly vindicated. While the virus still spread in Australia, it was not anything like what it would have been under Morrison. Keating's bushfire popularity bounced back and he slammed Dutton's suggestion for a JobKeeper welfare system, saying that we learned from the GFC that in a crisis, money needs to be given to the people and not to corporations. But there would be more difficulties abroad. By June, Trump's relationship with China had now become far worse than it ever was. Not only had Trump called it the China virus, but now Trump had passed the Uyghur Human Rights Protection Act, calling China's actions with its Uyghur Muslims in the West a genocide. Behind closed doors, Keating was furious.
You don't throw that word around like a ping pong ball. The Yanks are trying to wedge all of us on China. Pompeo's an absolute bully when it comes to diplomacy.
As other nations joined America in declaring China's actions to be genocide, Keating contacted Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, where the two spoke about what they would do. Together, they decided not to call it a genocide. However, the Kiwi press were much kinder on Ardern than the Aussies were on Keating. Earlier in the year, they'd called him a racist, but now they called him a China apologist. Aghast with rage, Keating said,
Have we called what we've done to our indigenous population a genocide? Do we call what Modi has done to the Muslims in Kashmir a genocide?
It was a moment of ill discipline on Keating's part, and Narendra Modi withdrew India's ambassador to Australia and even threatened to end their free trade deal with Australia. Trump even publicly chastised Keating, saying,
Australia has not been a very good friend. They used to be our best friends, but they are being very bad friends. They want to side with the Chinese who gave them the China virus. Very bad friends indeed.
It would get worse for Keating though. As 2021 rolled around and as Trump was replaced with Biden, Keating went to the G7 conference in Cornwall. As Keating was over there, Dutton gave a press conference saying,
Now this is a press conference I did not want to do, but in the interest of national security, it needs to be done. This morning, I was made aware that the Prime Minister declined America's offer of providing a fleet of nuclear submarines. The Prime Minister's affection for China has truly made him compromised on the issue of national security.
Keating returned home furiously and in Parliament roasted Dutton, saying that he'd go to war with his neighbour for not taking his bin in. Keating also piled into Dutton, saying that with the Libs not taking climate change seriously, the Solomon Islands had nearly flipped to China. Keating then hosted Prime Minister Sogavare for a state visit to demonstrate why he was actually much better than Dutton on national security. As 2021 ended, Sky News and even Channel 9 were ripping into Keating, insinuating that he was a compromised leader. Scott Morrison even called him the Manchurian candidate. In February of 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and though Keating sanctioned Russia, he was quiet about China not sanctioning Putin. Dutton used this as further ammo, saying that even Neville Chamberlain would have found Keating's approach to be weak. As the election rolled around in May of 2022, Keating campaigned on one more term to finish off the job of the Green Revolution. He campaigned on how well he had handled the two big crises that Australia had faced, but that this actually diverted his attention from what Australia had elected him to do back in 2019. Dutton's messaging was not surprising. Vote for the Libs so that you don't get invaded by China. This was a particularly dirty campaign filled with gotcha questions and smear. As Australia went to the polls in 2022, within an hour of election night, it was clear who was going to win. Seats that Labor had gained in 2019, like Reid and Robertson, were declared Liberal seats very early, and by 10 PM, Keating called Dutton to concede. To make matters worse, Keating lost his own seat of Griffith. Dutton congratulated Keating on his efforts during the fires and COVID, but said that his election win was a win for national security. Within weeks, Dutton had backflipped on the French submarine deal that Turnbull had signed, instead signing AUKUS. TikTok was banned in Australia, and Dutton said that China's treatment of the Uyghurs was undoubtedly a genocide. China responded by piling tariffs on Australia. When Dutton was asked how Australia would respond should Taiwan be invaded by the PRC, Dutton was clear. there would be no question of Australian intervention. Where does your story differ? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to learn about Keating's actual time in office, click here. If you know nothing about Australia's history, you can start learning all about it right here.